Good afternoon. I'm your moderator for this afternoon session. My name is Shimukunku, but you can call me Shimu from Zambia. And basically, I'll cut on the preamble, but in a nutshell, I think that the conversations in the morning, whether here or in the other venue, were really about this notion, right, that could exist, that a just transition in terms of climate compatible growth and industrialization for some people could be mutually exclusive if you relate it to industrialization. There could be that notion. But then in this session that we'll have this afternoon, we try and look at how we can still industrialize in the context of climate change. So over lunch, we had a conversation with some colleagues, and we were discussing some hardline stances that people have had in the past to say, okay, African countries may actually go through a path of industrialization like the Western world did, using the fossil fuels and so on. But that hardline stance, unfortunately, needs to be within the context of a green or a just transition. And so basically this afternoon, we're going to have presentations from a panel of experts who I have here and online to basically look at how we can industrialize in the context of climate change. And to be more specific, we're looking at industrial development in an era of climate change. So we will have some presentations online, 3 of them to be specific, and then I have 2 speakers who are here with us physically. So if you notice on the program, we're supposed to have 6 speakers, but the first presenter isn't able to join us. Nonetheless, we'll still proceed and have the other presentations. So for the first presentation, we're going to have Sören Hilbrich, who is joining us online, and he'll be presenting a paper on the implementation of sustainability taxonomies, the case of South Africa. So you'll notice that this paper was authored by a number of writers or researchers, but he will do the presentation on behalf of the entire group. So please make welcome Sören, who joined us online to make a presentation. And just before I allow him, when we get to the Q&A session, I've been advised that we should turn on the microphone as you speak so that the camera can then focus on you for online participants. So please make welcome once again Sören Hilbrich, who will make a presentation within 15 minutes. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction, and to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present at this great conference. I really enjoyed the other presentations today in the morning. And apologies that I'm not able to join in person. I would like to share and discuss with you the results of a research project on South Africa's green finance taxonomy. The green finance taxonomy is a classification system that defines what a green economic activity is, with the purpose to increase transparency on financial markets about the sustainability of investments. And as was already mentioned, this is a larger project with several collaborators. First of all, I would like to mention Sam Ashman, with the University of Johannesburg, and Lee and Steenkamp, Stellenbosch Business School. It's great to collaborate with them, and they are also at least online present today, so you could discuss this project also with them. And in addition, several colleagues from my institute, German Institute of Development Sustainability, IDOS were involved. You see the names here on the slide. I will first give you some background on sustainability taxonomies, and then I will focus mainly on the research project and the findings and policy implications of these findings with respect to the implementation of the South African green finance taxonomy. As I said, sustainability taxonomies are classification systems that define what is a sustainable economic activity and what is not sustainable. They include thresholds, criteria to define in detail what is sustainable and what not. And the purpose is to increase transparency on financial markets, to make it transparent to market participants what sustainability risks are associated with their investments, and ultimately that should then redirect capital flows from non-sustainable activities to sustainable activities. So it's a policy tools to finance, in a sense, the just transition. To serve this purpose, taxonomies would have to be used in several ways. Private actors would have to disclose on the taxonomy alignment of their portfolios, financial products, the turnovers of real economy firms, and so on. Taxonomies could also be used to determine the eligibility for green financial products, for instance, green bonds. And then ultimately, investors would have to take into account taxonomy alignment in their investment decisions and invest preferably in taxonomy aligned activities. What's remarkable is how fast this policy will diffused globally. By now, more than 25 jurisdictions have started to develop a taxonomy or have already implemented one. So this is remarkable. And South Africa is, compared to many other countries, was rather early in introducing a green finance taxonomy. Yeah? The South African GFT was published in April 2022. It's based and very similar to the EU taxonomy. And yeah, to be taxonomy aligned, economic activities have to meet several criteria. I won't go into depth into this now. But yeah, I guess so much as background, and I will now focus rather on our research project. Yeah, our research project in which we had a closer look at the implementation of the GFT and conducted interviews with a larger number of stakeholders from financial markets, real economy, public government departments, regulators, and so on, to get a closer, to get an in-depth understanding of the status quo of the taxonomy implementation and its potential impact. I think the most important finding is that so far the taxonomy is not used. 1 year after the publication of the taxonomy, we couldn't find any institutions that really use its taxonomy in its practical business, any institutions that publish a taxonomy disclosure report or uses the taxonomy in another way. In our study, we could identify some factors that could explain this fact, factors that hinder the implementation related to the governance of the taxonomy, its relationship with EU taxonomy, usability, and for the path dependency. I would like to have a closer look at each of these factors in the following, starting with the governance of the taxonomy. In South Africa, unlike in other countries, the GFT was introduced as a voluntary tool, so no one is obliged to use taxonomy. In addition, there were several governance actors involved in the implementation process, so it might also have slowed down the process. And we would recommend that regulators really set a credible signal to stakeholders that the GFT will become a common language on financial markets. Until now, market participants do not seem to be confident that the GFT will be the standard in the future. And from my perspective, mandatory disclosure rules might be necessary to set this signal. It's very difficult for individual market participants to disclose on the taxonomy if others do not, because due to the interrelated nature of financial markets, in this case, the data that is necessary to assess the alignment of one's own assets with the taxonomy is not available if others do not report. Might also be a good idea to set incentives for market participants. Development banks might have a role here. Tax reductions might also be an option to incentivize using the taxonomy. So this is the first very important factor, the governance of the taxonomy. Secondly, the relationship with the EU taxonomy is very important. The EU taxonomy is important because the European Union requires all financial and non-financial companies to report on the EU taxonomy, also with respect to the undertakings outside of the EU. So you also need to report on the EU taxonomy if you want to offer a financial product in the EU. We thus believe that the EU taxonomy will become an important standard on global financial markets. And to what extent the South African GFT is interoperable with the EU taxonomy will be important for its prospects. I think from the South African perspective, it would be ideal if the EU would be willing to formally recognize the South African taxonomy as equivalent to the EU taxonomy, in the sense that assets that had already been shown to be aligned with the GFT do not have to go a second assessment to be shown to be aligned with the EU taxonomy, as both taxonomies are so similar. Another factor concerns the capacities and expertise necessary to implement the taxonomy. Yeah, from financial market participants, we often heard that the taxonomy is a very complex document, and a lot of capacity and expertise is necessary to use it. We wouldn't recommend to simplify the taxonomy too much, because we think it's a complex endeavor to define for all kinds of economic activities what is sustainable and what not. So it's not possible to do it in a simple way with still keeping in mind the goal to really reducing greenwashing and creating transparency. So these concerns about capacity constraints should rather be accommodated with providing guidelines, trainings, exchange formats to support users of the GFT. Finally, for the path dependencies are also a factor hindering the uptake of the taxonomy. The financial sector is geared very much towards financing carbon-intensive industries. There's a lack of bankable green projects, so that might also reduce the incentives to implement taxonomy if there are so little projects that are aligned with the taxonomy. I think there's no easy way out, but this shows quite obvious fact that GFT can only make a contribution as part of a comprehensive policy package that aims at a just transition, and not as a alone standing policy. Finally, I would like to have a brief look at potential impact of the taxonomy if it would be implemented successfully. We also asked our interview participants from the financial sector if they would be willing to consider taxonomy alignment in their investment decisions. So whether the taxonomy could really redirect capital flows in support of a just transition. And many of them confirmed this proposition, so they seem to be willing to direct capital flows to taxonomy-aligned project, but to what extent it really plays out in practice, it's too early to say, yeah, because as I said, until now the taxonomy is not implemented. But at least there seems to be a potential to have really this impact on capital flows. However, one should also keep in mind that many of the structural barriers to sustainable investments, including a lack of bankable green projects, a lack of funding for small projects, a lack of early stage and high risk projects, a lack of funding for early stage and high risk projects, and these structural barriers cannot be overcome with the taxonomy. And in addition, the green finance taxonomy focuses until now exclusively on green objectives, So the social side of a just transition is not addressed in the taxonomy. So the taxonomy wouldn't make a contribution to increase funding for sectors such as education, reskilling, social protection that are also crucial for a just transition. So to sum up, there's tentative evidence that furthering the implementation of the GFT might be worth the effort, but it's also important to keep in mind that the contribution that the GFT can potentially make has its limits. So I think we have to conclude that so far, still early days, the GFT has not been a huge success, and it can arguably only become an effective tool to redirect capital flows and support the transformation of the economy if some of the factors that we identified as main barriers to an adoption are changed in the future. So thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to your comments and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sören. That was quite insightful. I think what I picked up were some of the findings of the study. And I think issues around the governance of taxonomy, also issues around the relationship with the EU mechanism, and then the usability. I think he did indicate some of the issues relating to capacity, and then the fossil path dependence. I think that was the key issue that he brought up. And towards the end, it was also insightful to see what this can and cannot do. And I think I noted issues around the fact that it can increase funding towards climate mitigation and adaptation, but notably, it cannot sort out the financing challenges that I think he did highlight, and that those would then need separate sort of actions to be able to deal with. So we'll have a question and answer session at the end where you'll be able to ask questions that may be specific to this. We'll now move on to the second presenter who'll be joining us online, like the first presenter, and this is Jason F. Bell, who is going to be making a presentation on green hydrogen for sustainable or industrialization in South Africa. And this is based on industrial policy for difficult-to-abate industries and linkages development. So this is a paper authored by 3 people, but he will make the presentation on behalf of the team. So allow me to welcome Jason, who's going to make a presentation within 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me and see my slides. Just given the time pressures, I'm going to jump straight into it. Thank you again for the platform. This is always a very interesting set of discussions that I had at these kind of events. So just to provide some context for our paper in particular, this is very much a foundational piece building off of Cred's larger body of work on the green industrial development and of course other climate change issues, while also looking to set an agenda for much needed and deeper sectoral level investigations to complement some of the very high level issues that we discuss in this paper and in this presentation. Now, just to provide some context of the core issues at the heart of the investigation is that one of these, the global economy stock inequalities, are currently being further unearthed due to the climate crisis. This is obviously well known that it's due to many already developing countries' history of dirty industrialization. And as time has passed, many of the consumers and activist sentiments within these countries have driven a flurry of climate change related policies being adopted, debated, and designed in the global north. And because of this, South Africa, owing to its own contribution to the poor state of climate and, of course, its high emissions, is at risk of being a victim of its own malfeasance. So then we ask how we react to the problems of climate change, particularly our high carbon dioxide emissions, has significant implications for our future industrial, competition, and trade policies in the era of the green transition. Of course, this necessitates us understanding how the green hydrogen and the green hydrogen transition might transpire. And some of the key overarching questions we ask is, will we have the capabilities and local linkages development that work towards creating a diversified green industrial base, or will we have the development of export enclaves primarily producing and providing inputs into the global north industries as we've currently seen in much of our history. So we focus in this paper on cement, steel, and chemicals, and we do this why? Well, because historically cement, steel, and chemicals production have tended to rank well above other sectors in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions. And crucially too, many of these sectors still feature predominantly in the industrial bases of many economies, with Africa, of course, being one person example here. Now, of course, the importance of these sectors to South Africa's industrial base presents several risks and opportunities that need to be considered. Now, in terms of the risks, some of the more pertinent of these include the more recent European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, along with a broader set of climate change focused policies that are encapsulated by the European Union's Green Deal. But given that South Africa's chemicals and steel sectors in particular have strong export focuses, these sectors are particularly at risk to the continuation of enclaves in the green economy if the inherent political economies of these sectors are not properly considered when developing policies to green these sectors. And thus moving away from the current energy intensive and resource-based sectors and into more higher value added sectors is urgent. In terms of opportunities, particularly in light of the risks facing these sectors in South Africa's case, which I guess threatens to lock in an unjust future, if future productive capabilities remain controlled among a few firms, the process of structurally transforming and decarbonizing these sectors can be partially aided by the development of a robust hydrogen economy. And therefore, we feel that if a successful implementation of a green hydrogen economy is achieved, it offers a viable route for the large-scale decarbonization in South Africa, most notably in the hard-to-abate sectors of cement, steel, and chemicals. Now, this is due in part to the strong linkages of these sectors and the linkage spillover potential for green hydrogen. However, a critical question is how the green hydrogen transition will take place. We consider, will it be part of an agenda focused on building local linkages to ensure that capabilities and inputs for renewable energy and, of course, other linkages to diversify the green industrial base are developed, or will we see the creation of green export enclaves very much inputting into the greening of global north industries and leaving us very far behind? Now, another crucial aspect that is such that a transition of this magnitude will not be easy. I think we all understand that it will be expensive, and its success will necessitate an active government interventionist approach that prioritizes market shaping over market fixing to help properly develop the requisite linkages and infrastructure to green these key sectors in particular, but also the wider economy. Now, of course, achieving such a massive shift in our industrial base will be challenging. At present, there are several barriers that exist to this process, and one of these in particular is the existence of an immature financial landscape that has in the past demonstrated very little affinity for funding the green economy, although this is slowly changing, as we notice in other work of ours. But what this has left is a significant dearth in renewable energy investments that has created systemic bottlenecks in transmission, storage, and balancing the energy technology mix. However, even if we were to rectify these issues, South Africa still, given its current industrial structure and conditions, and of course its political economy, risks developing a green hydrogen enclave centered around a few large firms. Therefore, it is essential in this process to frame green hydrogen transition from a structural transformation perspective, and one that in particular considers sector-specific transitions and the structural interdependencies and potential for linkages across the different sectors. As by quickly stepping into the key issues at play in each of the hard-to-abate sectors, several issues emerge. For instance, in chemicals, due to its vast linkages and of course looming large sassel over much of the sector's development and innovation, decarbonization will be a tricky process. And such a process will require converting the existing technology and infrastructure to ensure the efficacy of green hydrogen production and its utilization. But of course, we must also be aware of the objectives of Sasol given its dominance in the sector. From the perspective of the steel sector, decarbonization will involve the alignment of several factors, and these include the coordination of policies to promote the competitiveness of local industries while being cognizant of the current high costs of green hydrogen production. As part of this, South African policymakers must, of course, play a very careful game of trying to balance their objectives and targets with the strategies of multinational corporations, all seeking the highest returns on their own investments in green hydrogen across different regions. Now, lastly, in the chemical sector, and much like in steel, the global industry is dominated by a few large multinational firms who control production in many of the key markets. And as such, the future of the industry very much lies with the careful navigation of these firms' investment decisions to reduce their own carbon dioxide emissions. However, in South Africa's case, given that cement is relatively an untraded product compared to the likes of steel and chemicals, this transition should primarily be framed as developing domestic capabilities and linkages across local sectors. So what does government have to say regarding the green hydrogen transition? Well, if we look at the green hydrogen commercialization strategy, we see that it says a lot right from an industrial policy perspective at this stage. And for example, some of the key tools that they utilize, and I mentioned in the document, is the inclusion of a value chain approach, but also the recognition of the need for a blended financial landscape, I guess alluding to the immature green financial landscape I mentioned earlier, but also working towards fostering an enabling and conducive regulatory environment to ensure that benefits from any kind of commercialization of green hydrogen are well distributed among a broad set of the economy. However, such a complex plan, we all understand, I guess, this will necessitate the coordination of many actors and government departments to ensure that the policies remain targeted, focused, and of course, sector specific. Now, following this point through to the hard debate sectors, we note that the green hydrogen transition must prioritize several key points. And for instance, in chemicals, we must align Sasol's cost reductions with the wider industrial and infrastructural investments of the company as they seek towards a green hydrogen future. Now, of course, our strategies must prioritize the building of local linkages, but we must ensure that this closely aligns with the strong export orientation that already exists in the industry. Now, in terms of steel, any orchestrated investment plan must be governed under a set of policy conditionalities that work to overcome fragmentation and foster coordination across all government departments in negotiations with private entities. And then finally, for the cement sector, reinvestments must be undertaken by established prominent players to fast track the technological transition of their own plants for green hydrogen infrastructure. And as part of this process, a crucial geographic story must not be ignored within the green hydrogen transition because of the ability to locate much of this infrastructure close to sites of geographic concentration in the cement industry. Now, of course, achieving these sector-specific plans also requires the integration and alignment of them within a broader set of industrial policies, tools, and levers to ensure a successful transition of South Africa away from its dependence on coal into a green hydrogen future. And for example, the first of these is focusing on creating certainty for potential investments in the transmission grid that will help unlock renewable energy and closely link up with the development of green hydrogen infrastructure. Secondly, we must note that the green hydrogen framework should be part of a broader green growth agenda that really works towards more equally sharing its returns and ensuring the support of a broader base of the economy. Thirdly, shortfalls in our existing grid infrastructure need to be addressed and overcome, while we need to also look towards aggressively taking advantage of our well-documented solar and wind yields to competitively produce green hydrogen for use locally and, of course, potentially for export. Fourthly, we must work not to repeat our history of stop-start experiences that has plagued our renewable energy record and development since 2011. This has, of course, undermined government's credibility to take charge of such complex policies and projects that target the transformation of the economy away from its dependence on coal as a primary energy source. Fifth, as part of building and I guess rebuilding credibility in government actions, this can be assisted by engaging in the delinking of the energy base away from coal and establishing a separate independent transmission company. And then lastly, government must look to work more closely with the private sector and, of course, private sector leaders in green hydrogen to more concretely locate their own green hydrogen transition and plans as part of a wider structural transformation of the economy. So just to sum up and wrap up, I guess quite a lot of information thrown at you. What can we do? Well, to start, I mean, we can say that in the era of green hydrogen, industrial policy must be viewed as a fundamental set of tools and policies that aims to de-link South Africa's most egregious polluting industries away from coal, while also working towards creating entirely new markets, industries, and jobs in the green economy. Yet such a massive shift will not be successful solely through the actions of isolated actors, for example, those in the public, private, or civil society. We need a generalized and a collective approach towards sorting out many of the issues at hand and at play, And rather, we should view these challenges as a great green reset that rests on a few objectives. And these include the aforementioned fast-tracking of infrastructural investments, but also need to be complemented by the empowerment of a determined coalition of interests to form a green political settlement focused on building downstream industries whose benefits are inclusive, sustainable, and more equitably shared among a broad base in the economy. That does it for me. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Jason, for that very elaborate presentation. And I think it was quite detailed. Some of the key issues that came up were the justification for this green hydrogen transition. I think it's coming from the fact that these policies around the developed countries, the EU, to be precise, around trade policies that are targeting a more green production process across the globe. And I think he went on to be specific about the three sectors that he highlighted as the largest emitters, as the cement, steel, as well as the chemicals. And I think that's quite broad within the African continent. A lot of countries are involved in those particular sectors. And I think that then he went on to detail the specific strategies that would then need to be implemented in these three sectors to be able to move towards a green hydrogen transition. And I think what came out key is a transformative process in terms of that transition, which will then need a specific sector-based approach to be able to achieve this transition. So once again, thank you, Jason, for that presentation. We'll move on to the third presentation for this session, which is again being done online. And it will be presented by Nicola Wills, who is making a presentation on the domestic carbon offsetting standards and the international and institutional experience. So this presentation will be done within 15 minutes like the others, and then we'll move on to the next presentation. Nicola, over to you. Thank you.
So this presentation is on domestic carbon offset standards and the international and institutional experience. So this project or research was done by myself, Theo Covery and Linton Reddy, with support from the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Okay, next slide. So just serving as an introduction to this project. So looking at the voluntary carbon market, we've seen that there's been remarkable growth over the last few years. Estimates say that it'll grow upwards of $50 billion by 2030. It's therefore essential that measures are put in place to ensure both the integrity and then also that we, as our local South African economy, are deriving benefits. Additionally, there's multiple, so it's called additionality, permanence, avoiding overestimation, and then also eliminating double counting are all very important to make sure they're high quality credits. And what's quite important when it comes to South Africa as well is the whole additional sustainable development requirement, with need for positive socioeconomic impact, as well as job creation and supporting the overall just transition. So there are concerns when it comes to the quality integrity of the claims behind carbon offsets, which we deal with a bit later, and this becomes very important when looking at carbon standards. In terms of the nascent carbon structures, I'm just quickly moving this because I can't see what I'm doing. Okay, there we go. Nascent carbon structures and the rigor of carbon standards applied in registering carbon offsets within the standards are very important. Moving on. Okay, so the objectives of this research particularly was we wanted to kind of do an overview of national and international policy regulations and instruments that directly impact the carbon reduction measures in South Africa, as well as carbon offset standards, both local and international, looking what's out there, what their kind of, what their methodologies are, what's available, what their governance structures are, those sorts of things, and how those could impact carbon reduction measures in South Africa. Specifically then going on to look at best practice, both internationally and institutionally. So the following kind of key points were discussed. Firstly, the potential impact on the current regulatory framework, including carbon tax regime, South Africa's NDCs, and then there was other legislature and commitments, for example, COP, and things signed by the government that we looked at. We also then looked at the roles and contributions of South Africa's official standards and accreditation authorities. Because this is where it becomes a bit kind of difficult, because, you know, we know a carbon standard, but that isn't the same as a technical standard. So that's your South Africa Bureau of Standards, but they do come in because in terms of your methodologies, your people that then go on the ground, they have to still be SABS officials. So there's kind of some linkages there. So in that sense, your SABS does have a role. Then in terms of looking at having local carbon standards, because at the moment, if you look at the Carbon Tax Act, so how it works is you can either use a Vera, Gold Standard, or CDM, and those qualify for carbon tax. Otherwise, in the Carbon Tax Act, it says, or a standard that's been approved by the DMRE minister. As such, no standard has been approved, but we were specifically then looking, okay, is there scope for this? There is a DMRE framework, which very importantly needs to be signed by the minister so that these local standards can start coming online. There already is a lot of work being done in terms of local standards, but when the carbon tax at the moment, we're on stage 1. Stage 2 will go into effect beginning of 2026. And then carbon tax burdens for companies will increase. And at the moment, these kind of local carbon standards that are coming online, they do serve a purpose in terms of companies, putting it in their sustainable reporting, or if you want to offset your flight, those types of things, but it doesn't count for tax. So looking at, the South African context and all of that. So in terms of, so we first looked at the review of local and international use of private standards. This was undertaken to assess the potential or real impact they're having on South Africa's nascent carbon reduction efforts. And in doing so, we had 10 common insights identified and listed. So firstly, trust and integrity, super important, in terms of having rigorous project screening approach, strong regulators and auditors, and then as well as affordability. So you don't want it to be, because at the moment, you decide, okay, I want a project to be gold standard. You're looking at a minimum of R1 million. So you need that to be, so the market can grow and be inclusive. A sound governance structure and governing body. So for example, with CDM, you have an executive board. And yes, I know CDM, I'm aware that that's kind of a thing of the past, but it's still useful to look at their governance structures. And this executive board then will develop methodologies, rules, they also process those kind of pre-approvals, and they're also then responsible for the accreditation of those auditing bodies. Those auditing bodies then also have to be, for example, here, kind of your SABS approved. And SANAS as well, SANAS SABS kind of thing. So then thirdly, you need a registry system so that to ensure that you have no double counting. You also want an experienced standard subcommittee, so panels of working groups, specifically qualified experts. That's also when you're looking at your methodology, your actual, mathematical equations that are calculating, how much carbon emissions have been saved or avoided. And that you would also want independent third-party kind of bodies on that, and auditors that kind of every few years go back and see what's happening. Then sixth, also we would want strong stakeholder engagement. So both public, private and civil society engaging on issues that are rising, as well as commenting on kind of rules of the structure of the standard, the methodologies created and used, because you really want transparency and trust, which you would have seen news articles about, I think it was Vera in the last 2 years with the forest, the Amazon forest issues. So that is something that becomes very important. Then another important thing is focusing on, those co-benefits. So having local projects, for example, a waste picking project in kind of some rural area, smaller projects that have a lot of gains for the local communities, and are specific to that country context. You would also want linkages with global markets. So you still want to have that, you can buy Vera credits, even though you have your own local carbon market, and vice versa, which comes into play with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, where you kind of what is envisioned is this global carbon market. So just to go to 10 is you want evidence of preparation with regard to this Article 6. Another importance is project legitimacy, which then goes back to, strict adherence and monitoring of the principles of those additionality, double counting, leakages, permanence, and reversal risks. And you want processes in place to make sure that these are, everything's ensured, and as well as proof that it can be provided. In terms of then looking at national and national policy and regulation instruments. So what we did is we mapped out the relevant stakeholders and then kind of looked at their roles and responsibilities. In terms of then policy regulation, we then looked at specifically carbon tax, as well as barriers associated with the current use of international standards, South Africa's NDC targets, the PPC's work on the Just Transition Framework and the investment plan, as well as finance agreements and discussions at COP27, as well as Article 6, as I just mentioned, and then also the national standards, which, so what happens is we have these 3 ISO standards, which then SABS takes and they become SABs, which are, SANS standards, South African national standards. Okay, so then the next slide just shows a table where we looked at, so we had National Treasury, so that's very important in terms of needs to be credible standard in terms of tax, National Treasury. Then DFFE was looking specifically, so they are very involved with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, as well as looking at NDC targets. Then the PCC, we know, are very involved with the whole just transition narrative, and also, again, aligning with NDCs. The Department of Mineral Resource and Energy are the designated national authority in terms of this domestic carbon offset program. And they have created this draft framework for local standards, which very importantly needs to be signed to get this process going. I think it was out for public comment at the end, I think it was last year. And it's, the comments have been taken in at least a year ago. So that's very important. Then in terms of your accreditation and your players in national standards, you have the DTIC as well as SABS and SANAS. You also then have your provincial and local governments, as well as your private sector that you have to start considering as well. Then we also did a high-level overview of 8 different countries. 8 different countries. And we originally wanted to do like a sort of benchmark and pick 3, but we found that everyone was, yes, you know, there's some similarities to approaches, but they're all very different. So we rather just took all 8 and kind of came up with some commonalities that we thought were super important. So we used the 2020 ICAP status report, and we took Australia, Japan, South Korea, Colombia, USA, specifically California, because they do it by state, Canada, Kazakhstan, and China. And here our kind of 10 take-home points specifically were, okay, so the first one was looking at having a clearly coordination and clearly defined governance structures. And this specifically we found it for Australia, Japan, and California. Number 2 was the co-design and use of independent teams for the generation of the methodologies, which are your actual, okay, I want to do a waste picking project or a renewable energy project. Then you go to that methodology, look how it's done. That's how the calculations happen. And there we saw Australia, Japan, and Canada had very useful case study examples. Thirdly, it's very important to realize that carbon offset standards are going to be scrutinized, and because they are, you know, complex documents and they're huge resourcing requirements. And so that's very important to keep in mind. So here we saw, for example, Australia, they kind of, I think there was a pause and now they're back, and there were issues around integrity. Colombia as well, some issues there in terms of also accounting for tax, because now it's causing the government to get less tax revenue if you've got these kind of cheap credits that are kind of, are they actually, you know, doing what they say they're doing? As well as Kazakhstan, there were also some points of contention on that one. Fourth, active involvement in methodology construction and continuous innovation. Here we again see, so you want, you know, new updating methodologies and creating new ones when they need to be created by the correct, you know, independent people. There is also, with methodologies, there is a financial incentive. So if your methodology gets improved and people use your methodology, you do then get royalties. So it's not kind of, yeah, there is a financial gain there. Here we saw Australia, Korea, Japan, and Canada had useful case studies, and all these. So in the actual paper, which will be the tips will be available from tips, we go through all these countries in detail, so the case studies are all there. So fifth was very important to have that independent element, independent assessment bodies, member-based advisories, inspection bodies, those sorts of structures with kind of embedded within the carbon offset standard. Another point was that, you know, it's not always great just to start from scratch. You can draw on a wealth of experience of established international carbon markets, successes, failures, and go from there as well. Same as methodologies, drawing on methodologies already used, because they are mostly freely available from the various carbon standards. Then really important is recognition of carbon offsets generated by other carbon standards. So this was done in various ways. For example, Korea did it by stages, where it was first, okay, no, we're only going to accept local. Then we're going to accept, I think it was gold standard, but it has to be owned by Korean companies. So there were kind of levels of how it was done. The eighth point was the importance of having safeguards and oversights in terms of the relationship with the carbon tax, specifically going into 2026, where you're going to have companies like Sasol who are going to have a huge carbon burden. And, you know, this is a lot of money that can go into local projects that can see really good work being done. Another point is clarity on private registries and coexisting. So South Africa, as it stands, does have, we have quite a few. I know the one is Credible Carbon, there's Carbon Neutral Group. Again, these, I'm sure, and I know some of them are working on local standards, but they don't count for tax as it stands. So looking at, you know, are they going to follow this process? If not, are they going to kind of stay out of the tax area? What's going to happen there? And then number 10 was looking at this phased implementation approach, where I did talk about Korea and how they just had this incremental approach of what they kind of accepted the credit wise. Then, so in terms of some concluding remarks, as I'm sure we're all aware, with the carbon markets, there are a lot of challenges that need to be addressed if it's going to be successful in the long term. And therefore, I think I've said this 2 or 3 times, but it's really important that the DMRE framework is signed so that the potential of a local carbon market can actually be fully realized. And delays represent a barrier because small projects are not able to come online and become compliant with the carbon tax unless they use really, really expensive international standards, which is prohibitively expensive. And also it doesn't always cater for their needs. There might not be methodologies that exist for the kind of projects that they want to be doing. Then if they were to actually use those international standards and then the framework is signed, why would they want to come back and do local processes, that sort of thing as well. So lastly, so yeah, as we say, additional delays are just kind of causing expenses that we kind of aren't great. And it's also creating a disincentive for large polluters who then, they can just pay the carbon tax burden. They don't if the credits are going to be too expensive. And that's missing out on a larger opportunity where, this tax money can be paid and channeled towards projects in low carbon, moving towards this low carbon economy with economic growth and large socioeconomic benefits. As we know, complex project in terms of quantifying and verifying, very susceptible to manipulation and inaccuracies. And that's why it's really important that there's trust among participants, investors, regulators, etc. And yeah, credibility, really, really important, needs to be established. Last page. So in terms of the carbon markets, they're going to be winners, they're going to be losers. There are some very energy intensive companies who are very dependent on fossil fuels, and that's going to be quite a financial loss if they either have to pay the tax or they're going to have to invest in emission reductions or purchase those carbon offsets. And so, the design of and implementation of the mandatory carbon market and, cap and trade system or carbon tax going into the future. We do have the carbon tax, as I said, 2026, cap and trade kind of still, it's not a thing as of yet, but there are discussions. So yeah, this is going to kind of determine winners and losers and what happens in the end. But just kind of to press, there is huge potential there for mitigating climate change. And at the moment, it is a lot of uncertainty and lack of transparency. So addressing these issues, really important with funding, collaborative governance in order to ensure successful implementation. And that is me. Thank you so much. I'm going to pause share, I think. Cool, thanks.
So we'll proceed to the 4th presentation for this afternoon. And the presentation is going to be made by Seutame Maimele. I hope I pronounced your name right. And he's going to make a presentation on the European Green Deal and its implication for African trade. So I'll hand over to Maimele to make a presentation within 15 minutes. Over to you.
So my presentation is based on the European Green Deal and its implication for African trade. So I think the previous speakers have been touching, some of these issues, especially when it comes to market access of some of the other products, considering climate change issues that we currently facing. So I'm just gonna dive deep into that, and my presentation is structured into 4 parts. So the first part is to just break down what the European Green Deal is. Of course, it's really difficult to understand the European Green Deal as a whole, because what we've realized now is that a lot of people are studying pieces and parts of the European Green Deal. For example, there's carbon border adjustment mechanism. Others, they're studying deforestation-free supply chains, regulations. But in this case, I'm just gonna highlight the mechanism in its entirety in that first part. The second part will be highlighting, how Africa would, trades with the EU. And the third part will be highlighting the implications of the European Green Deal in Africa, and highlighting, as the last part, what, we can actually do in that regard. So the first section, which I think is really focusing more on understanding the European Green Deal, is that from 2019, I know that from 2019 to now, there have been a lot of debates about green deals and the likes, but from 2019, the European Union introduced the European Green Deal as both, an economic recovery plan and a climate change policy to, reflect more on some of the other issues that were pertinent then. For example, some of the other issues were COVID-19, and now there's a lot of debates around climate change. So within that context, the EU, and the EU is not the only group or even regions that have introduced climate change policies. For example, in the US as well, they've introduced some of these policies. But from then, the main intent of the policy was to actually make the EU as the first climate neutral group or continent, right, in the world by 2050, and I'm sure that by 2025 there's 2030. So there are a lot of plans around that timeline, saying that by 2030 at least 50% or 55% of GHG emissions for a certain region needs to be reduced, and later on achieving climate neutrality. So within that ambition, right, so there's a lot of sectors that are included in the package or pillars. So some of those pillars, I've just highlighted them here. So from there, you'll start to see that, the pillars are supported by, legislations. And, as I've mentioned earlier on, that a lot of people are, actually looking specifically at those legislations or directives and trying to understand how those legislations from the EU can impact, other regions across the world. So they are, I've grouped these pillars. So I'm sure that maybe someone else who have studied this might have a better visual, but the vision that I have here is to try to put in place some of the legislations, directives, or strategies under those sectors that I mentioned on the screen here. For example, under climate ambition, there is what they call the climate law. So it has been adopted, so which gives direction on how climate change should be solved in the EU. And they have two targets there, timelines. 2030, by 2030 they want to reduce their net GHG emissions by 55%, and by 2025 2050 achieve climate neutrality. And one of the other legislative pieces that falls under the climate ambition is the carbon border adjustment mechanism, right, which is focusing more on using carbon border tax as a tool to incentivize or promote climate action in Europe and everywhere else in the world. And also there's adaptation strategy, which focus more not on the mitigation side of things, but on the adaptation. And there are also other issues that, other legislation or pieces that goes, that promote climate ambition in the EU. I'm not gonna, highlight some of those. Then there are environmental, legislations that, the EU is also using to incentivize, the European Green Deal. There's biodiversity strategies there, forestry strategies, and regulation on deforestation-free supply chains, which focuses more on, goods such as, beef or meat, or looking at your cocoa. And in the energy space, with the main intent to produce clean energy in that space there are also a lot of legislative piece that falls under that. Agriculture, there's farm to fork strategy in that space. Then in the industries and in transport sectors, they also have some legislation or pieces that support the European Green Deal. Then underpinning that is what I think the previous speakers, even in the last sessions, the just transition issues and how to finance that have been highlighted, in the EU as well is based in their European Green Deal, based on the just transition principles and how that can be financed, going forward. Then as the next section, which highlights how Africa trade. So here I just put a lot of graphs here, but it gives a lot of indication of where how Africa trades with the world and how Africa trades with the EU. And from this context, you start to see that, and I'm just using 2021 numbers. Of course, there are, I think, latest numbers, 2022. But looking at, the 2021 numbers, you start to see that Africa, as much as, from outside, it might look like Africa is, trading. It has a larger portion in terms of trade. It doesn't actually. So you start to see here that they export at least 2.5% of world, exports, and just 2.7%, of imports. And in the EU, looking at the bloc with Africa, then you start to see that Africa is an important trading partner with the EU, but the EU doesn't see Africa as an important partner because, those 2.5% and 2.7%, those are almost the proportion of the African exports within the EU. So we trade a lot with the EU, but the EU doesn't trade a lot with us. So within that context, you see that 2021, the exports that came from Africa, 26% of that were coming from the African continent. We exported them there. 27% were imports. So, EU is one of the important trading partner with Africa. And of course, there are other trading partners there. So you see that there's Africa, intra-African trade. So it's 18%. There's, China and the others there. But, specifically looking at the EU, we start to see that the EU is become, it has been an important trading partner with us, and whatever they're doing is going to actually impact the continent. Then just looking at, who in the African continent, trades with the EU, then you start to see that actually looking at North Africa and, South Africa, specifically in the southern region, those are the, key markets or partners that trade with the EU. And you can see from there that South Africa is one of the other important trading partners with the EU. And of course, also North African countries. And with the introduction of the European Green Deal, or even some of the other components included in the European Green Deal, is that some of these countries will be heavily impacted or, heavily exposed to the introduction of some of these measures. And just to also give another context is that I think this, our picture has always been making rounds that Africa exports a lot of primary goods and, and imports a lot of manufactured products. And as you can see here, over time, and even if, looking from 2011 to, to recent 2021, you start to see that Africa still exports a lot of primary goods in a form of raw materials. And, I think earlier on, there were presented on some of the critical minerals and how important that we have to focus more on some of the resources that the African continent has. And of course, a lot of that comes from, the energy space. So there are mineral fuels there. So in terms of oil and gas, so we export a lot of that to the EU. And in return, we, import, machinery and vehicles and other manufactured products there, including chemicals. And I think with Jason presented on the green hydrogen, which highlighted that is an opportunity. And from this picture as well, you can see that it's also an opportunity, across the continent. But so this is, how Africa trades with the EU. Then in the next slide, you start to see that here is an extensive analysis of what's actually included in the European Green Deal and how, how other countries are actually exposed in terms of trading some of the other goods there. So from here, you can see that there are actually 24, I think the 25 products that are included there. Of course, if you break it down, you find that the products are a lot. But from here, you see that, from meat to forestry, coffees, oils, the furniture, I think 25 was supposed to be cement. So there are also like sebum goods included in the European Green Deal there. And from, taking all of those goods that are included in the European Green Deal, you start to see that 85% of those goods are actually exported into the EU, right? So that actually means that whatever the EU does, and for example, in the next few coming years, even now, is that whatever is going to be doing, what they will be highlighting is that they will close the market for these African, products that goes into the EU, and that becomes a problem, for some of these products and some of the firms that export a lot of these products, right? So that's in terms of exposure, but looking specifically in terms of vulnerability, GDP as well as exports. So this is taking in terms of proportion, right? Proportion of total goods included in the European Green Deal in proportion to total GDP of each country of the African continent or total exports. So that highlights how vulnerable some of these countries are, or how dependent are they into the EU market. So whatever the EU is going to be doing, then maybe some of these countries might not be able to respond because of the impact that will be they will feel in terms of the EU and the other jurisdiction introducing measures that will be harmful to the continent. And from here you can see that there are a lot of countries here. It's just that I had to cut the other ones because they couldn't fit to the slide. But what you can see here is that North African countries, in terms of their GDP vulnerability, are going to be, impacted by the introduction of the European Green Deal. And of course, in terms of exports as well, they are also heavily exposed, or they are vulnerable in that manner. So as my last slide, I think just coming from giving you the context of the policy, is that there will be some measures that I think the African continent would need to do in terms of being responsive to some of these measures, and just to start off with some of the what we can do in the meantime is that we know that the African Union, or the African Free Continental Area, doesn't include the component of climate change there. So what needs to happen is that climate change issues, considering some of the issues and the exposure of some of these measures that are being introduced elsewhere, is that if we don't become more climate resilient, we're not going to have market access later on, which becomes a problem for the continent in terms of industrialization and jobs later on. So what needs to happen is that the AU, even the African Free Continental Area, needs to incorporate the climate change issues in terms of the economic development of the continent. So climate change needs to be incorporated there in terms of highlighting some of the other issues, economic issues that comes with some of these measures. So that's what needs to happen in the meantime. And again, I think Nicola touched on some of the carbon markets, specifically on carbon offsetting, but looking specifically at the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is that we will need to have infrastructures in place, especially that speaks to carbon markets, for example, carbon pricing, carbon offsetting and carbon credits later on to be utilized in the continent to, for example, collect some of the revenues that we can leverage later on to solve some of these climate change issues. So there is a need to create regional carbon markets. There is progress, especially if you look at in South Africa now, that carbon markets, through carbon tax, they are being actually implemented in that regard. But there is a need for a regional approach in terms of creating some of these markets so that we retain some of the funds that comes, or some of the opportunities that comes with the introduction of this mechanism. And of course, the other recommendation that we can do is that some of these policies, they raise a lot of issues, especially at the WTO. And what we can do now is that some of the other issues that have already been highlighted, under WTO can, be utilized, or we can see this as an opportunity to say that, with the introduction of some of these mechanisms elsewhere, then it gives, global South countries or developing countries an opportunity to negotiate a better deal, especially at the WTO. Right. So we've seen this recently with the COVID-19, where there was a waiver with the TRIPS, the intellectual property rights, aspect of, allowing, for example, other countries to manufacture some of these goods. So within this context, what we see that as much as some of these policies are not regarded as, for example, green or climate change policies, there are, green or climate change policies. And within that context, there are some other issues that arises there in terms of, for example, production of solars and the likes, because of some of the intellectual property rights that comes with that. Then through the WTO, some of those issues can be highlighted there, and probably maybe the global south countries or Africa as a whole can have a better deal and leverage some of those possibilities for its own development. And of course, I think at the WTO as well, what we see is that for some time is that there has been no link between climate change and trade, and with the opportunity now is that we can actually create a link between those two components, looking that we know that climate change impacts trade and trade impacts climate change. And we, of course, there were a lot of I think during lunchtime that Africa doesn't contribute a lot to total GHG emissions, and with that there are some principles, especially at WTO, or even looking at the UNFCCC. So some of those principles can also be leveraged, right, to reform in general the multilateral systems. Yeah, so of course, with a whole lot of some of the other stuff that are being introduced, there's got to be a need for introducing capacity building, or technical transfers from, for example, what the EU is doing, which we know that is going to impact Africa. Then we might need to have some of those programs in place so that we are prepared, to respond to some of these measures, right? Yeah, I think that's my presentation there in a nutshell. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Maimele. I think that was quite insightful. I think from the background, he was able to give a preamble of what the European Green Deal is, and what was interesting were some of the findings based on the data that he gave around our exposure as the African continent to the European Green Deal. And I noted, for instance, 84% of our exports are basically exposed to the European Green Deal. And I think we're able to see that from the presentation that he made. And he moved on to highlight the exposure in terms of GDP, which was estimated at about 5%. I think that's quite telling, and it should get us thinking around the productive processes that are happening in Africa and how we have to think ahead in terms of the implications of the European Green Deal. And lastly, he was able to highlight some of the measures that we need to undertake in light of this European Green Deal. And what I picked up from there is that we need to embed this sort of thinking into our policies, starting from the FCFTA, our domestic policies, and so on. So I think this is quite insightful for us as a continent, and we need to get thinking about our industrial policy and our exports in relation to the European Green Deal. We'll move on to our last presentation for this session, and this is going to be given by, allow me just to call you Alboricah, and the presentation is going to be on nipping economic stagnation in the bud, the role of transmission infrastructure in South Africa's green economy industrialization. Please make welcome Alboricah, who will make a presentation in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I don't know if you guys need a second to maybe introduce yourself, because it's been a long day. Even I'm sleepy and I'm supposed to present. So I totally empathize with everyone's feelings of exhaustion. But let's just try to push through the last session. I promise it's just 4 slides, but I'm probably also going to use 15 minutes. So it's not really good news for you. But yeah, so today I want to talk about the power transmission infrastructure, or the grid, which is the network of pylons and high voltage power lines and transformers that transport our electricity from power stations to the end users, so our households and our businesses. And then if you've been in South Africa for at least 5 minutes, you will know that is very much undermined by load shedding. And load shedding really is negatively impacting our economy because it means that factories can't run all the hours they're supposed to run. It means even a business owner who's just a hairdresser can't always have their hairdryer on to essentially drive that customer. So it really affects business. And then according to the South African Reserve Bank, stage 6 load shedding in one day can actually cause South Africa to lose 899 million rand in a day because of the productivity that is lost. So it's really a huge issue. And obviously there's lots of minds that's trying to come up with solutions for solving this problem. And one of the recommendations papers that we have from the PCC is that the best way to impact on load shedding and actually reduce it is to the cheapest, fastest, and most sustainable way to reduce load shedding and essentially just have energy security is to put on more renewables, coupled to storage as well as peaking support. And South Africa was well on its way to doing this with the REAP, with the different bidding rounds where we're auctioning off power so that we can plug in more renewables onto the grid. But the very last bid window round, which was bid window 6, taught us that it's not just the generation problem anymore, it's a transmission problem. And this means that we can have as much generation as we want, but if there's nothing to plug it onto, we're not actually going to affect our load shedding or have any more secure, have a more secure energy system. So if we just look at what the grid means for the economy, it essentially means that it's essentially a precondition for a functioning economy because everyone needs power in order to go about their day, whether it's in households or it's in business. And even the National Infrastructure Plan describes the infrastructure, and the grid is one of those public infrastructures as a non-negotiable precondition for structural transformation and an inclusive economy. Even the JET IP acknowledges that the grid is the most immediate investment requirement if we actually want to continue towards our path to the goals that we've put together in the National Development Plan for 2030. So the grid is a lot of things. It's also an enabler of green economy. So if we're having renewable power, it means that we also need to have battery, and then that's opening up a whole new market because as you know, if you've read the latest South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, you'll see that there's also quite a big section there that talks about battery and value chains that could open up because of that battery market that comes with a renewable energy system or an energy system that has more renewables inside of it. So the grid really is like the first step in the sequence of steps towards accomplishing the structural transformation that we want to see in the country, towards achieving the national development goals, and towards just operating every day, being able to make coffee, being able to go to work and actually have power. So we need this grid to function. But another thing that the grid is that it's an industrialization opportunity as well. So if we look at that barrier I mentioned of how we can't put on more generation onto the grid just because there isn't enough infrastructure, there isn't enough power lines, there's not enough transformers in the places where we need them to be. So we need to build that out so that we can actually have more generation that goes online. So now if we were to quantify this need so in order for us to actually have energy security by 2030, in the next decade, we need to be putting on something like 53,000 megawatts of electricity onto the energy system. And then that 53,000 megawatts requires 14,218 kilometers of transmission to be built in one decade. And just to give you a bit of perspective, in the last decade, we only did 4,300. So our current capacity in terms of what the country can actually build is around 400 kilometers per year. But what we need to be doing is actually 2,300 kilometers per year. So that's a huge, huge expansion opportunity for local companies in the electrical and civil spaces, as well as the manufacturing spaces where they can manufacture like steel parts for the pylon or the steel towers, the sections that are used to build them up. So if you look at this graph, it's showing in terms of these transmission projects, how they work is that they actually take around 7 years from the inception of the project. So like going and finding land and then getting the correct permits, and then doing the project preparation that needs to take place. So actually the building will actually, majority of it will actually have to happen in the last 5 years of the coming decade, because then all the preparation work would have had to been done prior to that. And then if that amount of work is only done in the last 5 years, you need the current local capacity to actually scale up by almost 8 times as much as what they currently do now, which is why I think it's a huge industrialization opportunity, because it means that it gives these firms room to grow and actually occupy and actually just have more pipeline of projects that keeps coming in, because the grid needs so much work. So now if we look at what it will take to actually make this happen. So this is actually a 2-part question. So what it will take to actually grow out the grid. So the list of 4 things you see is actually taken from a report called Better Finance, Better Grid. And then this is actually answering what it takes for the grid to be built out in the next decade. So the first thing is access to sufficient capital, which you'll know is a big thing because Eskom is in quite a huge debt crisis. But there's been movement along there with National Treasury from the budget speech also coming in and providing some relief, but also just the complexity of what that means for the transmission division, especially now when it unbundles to become its own entity. There's also planning and permitting hurdle. That's essentially talking to all of the preparation work that needs to happen before the building actually takes place. Because I mentioned just now that it takes 7 years. So like the fact that it takes so long before you can actually commission a piece of infrastructure means that there's definitely a lot of stuff that can be improved there to just make it, to just expedite the process. We also have procurement of materials. It's essentially sourcing the materials, and apparently a huge barrier here is just the current makeup of industrial policy is actually prohibiting us from being able to move forward. So essentially just looking at what kinds of assessments and what kinds of reviewing needs to happen for industrial policy in order to actually benefit both the expansion process as well as the local companies. Because if the industrial policy isn't benefiting either one, what is it doing? Why is it being a barrier there? And then lastly, it's also a qualified workforce. So those were the barriers that were listed by that particular report. And then what I'm now going to list is essentially the challenges according to the CEO of Adenco Construction, which is the biggest Black-owned civil and electrical construction company in South Africa. So this was during a live debate where we were talking about the grid. And then the question was, what would it take for you as a company to be able to scale up, as well as all the other civil and electrical construction companies in South Africa to scale up and actually be able to tackle this grid expansion challenge? And these were the things he said. So he said there's one of the barriers is the technical capacity and workforce. Essentially, there isn't a lot of even from the pool of existing engineers, a lot of them are not accredited, or they don't go to the extra step of actually getting that accreditation in place. So it was like something like 19%, only 19% of the engineers in our municipalities are actually accredited, like they go the extra step to become qualified to that extent. So now this obviously now creates a very small pool of engineers to choose from that can be hired by these EPCs. And you have a lot of competition because they can always go to consultancies, they can always go to IPPs and other international companies that will pay them a lot more. So we have this big demand, but we don't actually have enough engineers that are willing to actually go into that EPC space. And then the second thing he noted was the execution capacity. So he said the EPC or engineer, procure and construction companies that need to undertake this work need to invest a lot of money in getting the equipment that's required to do the work that needs to be done. And you can't really invest in like a 20 or 30 million rand a piece of equipment if you only have one project. So there needs to be certainty of a pipeline of projects that are coming in to say, okay, even if I'm investing this much money, I know that for the next 2 to 3 years, I have certified projects that are going to be coming in, and this is building out the grid so I can invest more in equipment, I can invest more in getting the necessary expertise that the company requires to actually fulfill the work. And then so that's the certainty of pipeline and the execution capacity, which talks to being able to invest in equipment. And then another thing he mentioned was guarantee facility. So with these big projects, the developer or the client will require the contractor to be able to give performance guarantees, warranties, those type of things, up to like 20% of the project cost. And the EPCs in South Africa that are local and small, they just don't have the balance sheet for that. So then this is where he mentioned that we sort of need DFIs like the Development Bank of South Africa to come in and actually be able to assist in providing the facility, the guarantee facilities that these EPCs need in order to take on the projects. Otherwise, it might as well just go to the international guys that have the balance sheet to support the projects, in which case, there'll be obviously a lot more limited local development in terms of people that are actually taking up the jobs that the grid expansion is creating. And also just going back to that execution capacity, you also talked about very limited technical schools in South Africa. Like there's very, very few. I don't actually know of myself of any high schools that are purely technical, that are emphasizing those skills of learning technical skills and to go into the construction and manufacturing areas. I think they're quite general. And then, there's very few of those happening in South Africa. So that was also something else that he looked at. And then some of the opportunities he mentioned was that we could bring in people like old engineers that have retired or that are no longer doing the work that currently now needs to be done, to actually come back and mentor like the younger engineers that are available, so that they can be able to do and occupy these roles in the grid expansion project. So if we just look at what needs to happen, it just feels like there's actually quite a lot of moving parts and stakeholders that I feel are advancing on the expansion, on the grid expansion project. Quite recently, Eskom released a request for information with pre-qualification for manufacturers with potential to supply fabricated steelwork to construction companies for transmission expansion as per the Eskom transmission development plan. So there's definitely movement in terms that they're now actually putting out feelers in the market to see like who are the manufacturers that can actually supply to the construction or EPC contractors that need to do the work. Like who are the guys locally that are able to do this, that can then submit that can then answer to the RFIs. And then you also have the infrastructure fund, which is within the Development Bank of South Africa, which is also actively trying to mobilize capital, like different types of capital, to actually be able to finance this grid expansion process. And of course, within that, there's also the complexities of ownership and the types of models that will happen in terms of how the private sector interacts with the public sector, like what are the models that will be built, operate, transfer, like those types of conversations are also happening at one level. Then you also have big corporates on the private side and the smaller local EPC such as Adenko that I already mentioned, and ARB Electrical Wholesale. So those are the BEE companies that need to sort of scale up, that have been doing transmission projects on a much smaller scale. So it feels like the grid has become the nexus of a meeting point for the different actors, and it just feels like there's a strategy that is lacking, especially when it comes to building local capacity, because it really is a huge opportunity if these small companies could actually scale up, employ more people, and be able to occupy more of this grid expansion process. And then so my curiosity is essentially how is industrial policy actually interacting with this challenge? How is it meeting the real life challenges that were identified? Is it actually being a barrier, or is it actually being an enabler? And how do we like study that and then break that down so that it can be applied in a way that is functional? So it's similar to how we now have a master plan for the renewable energy system. What would a strategic industrial plan look like for the grid expansion? Because it's also multi-sectoral. It involves construction, it involves steelworks, it involves manufacturing, it involves EPC, small guys, big guys, it involves DFIs, it involves ESCOM that is now unbundling. So there's quite a lot of complexities as well involved. So it just feels like there should be some kind of industrial policy, industrial strategy put in place to properly harvest this opportunity for the local economy. So essentially, I was writing this paper as a calling for a well-defined industrial strategy involving both public and private sectors that makes it possible to build the grid while creating economic opportunities for local industries, through targeted capacity building, and other initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alboricah, for that detailed presentation. And I think what was clear is that the grid is really at the center. And like she mentioned at the end, basically trying to look at how this fits into the whole narrative of industrialization, whether it's actually a hindrance or it's contributing to progress around that. Thank you very much once again. So we have come to the part where we get questions and answers. A lot has been presented, 5 presentations, but I'm sure you were taking note of particular areas where you had questions. So I'll start with questions from people here physically. We'll pick 3, and then we'll go to the online questions. That will then move us back to the group here. So I will ask for questions or comments. I'll pick 3. So we have 1 there, 2, and 3. Then we'll go to the online questions. Thank you. Please remember to turn on your mic so that you can be captured on the video.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. So Mohammed Patel from TIPS. So my question is for, I hope I'm pronouncing the name right, Sören, so the presentation related to sustainability taxonomies. So on the slide that had the impact of the taxonomies, one of the points that was mentioned was the internal management of private actors. I just wanted to understand in a bit more detail what that means. Thanks. I have another question. I don't know if I can do it for another presenter.
Yeah, you can do it now.
Okay,
So
all right, so I'll just do it now as well. So it's on the presentation on green hydrogen for sustainable reindustrialization for Jason. So there were a lot of suggestions around, so the backward linkage towards renewable energy and ensuring some of the things are in place there. But what I was hoping for was to see some specific industrial policy suggestions or tools or measures specific to the green hydrogen value chain. So around electrolyzer costs, for example, the MEAs, the catalysts, etc., even at the production stage. Because we face this classical problem when you have a new sustainable industry, there's some way to go in terms of cost parity with the incumbent technology. So I just, any suggestions or insights around that? Thanks.
Thank you. So I've also got 2 questions. The first one also is for Sören. So it's a bit worrying that he says the green taxonomy is hardly being used, which presents 2 things for me. One is, should he not then use a different approach for just transition in a different taxonomy, rather than trying to adapt the green taxonomy, which is not being used? And then it also talks to the need for different processes. So embedding the use of the taxonomy within the finance industry and linking it to practical on the ground financing activities. So that's my first question to Sören. My second one is for Jason. He says a very worrying thing, that the green hydrogen is not commercially viable. But then doesn't go into the risks of that. He just says, no, but then we must just still carry on looking at this in terms of industrial policy. But if it's not commercially viable, then why are we doing all of this? So is there an assumption in his thinking that it does become commercially viable? Are parts of it commercially viable? So I'd like to hear more on his thinking about the risks around that. Thanks.
Thank you. Then we'll have the last question from Ashraf.
Thank you so much. My name is Ashraf. I'm from Ministry of Mining, Malawi. My question goes to the final presenter, Alboricah. I was just very fascinated with the presentation because I've noted that we have a similar issue on the energy, especially electricity. But then I wanted to have an understanding the case of South Africa in as far as issues of energy is concerned. I don't know if you clearly stated that, but I've noted that you did not describe the foundation or the origin of the problem that we actually have in South Africa. Is it about like priorities upside down, or is it about political will, or there is something else that is leading to maybe the government and all stakeholders or the players not considering expansion of the grid in this regard? I wanted, if you could come in on that one and try to shed more light, if in your study you found out why this is happening the way it is happening. Thank you.
We can go to Alboricah to respond to the last question. Then once we have the IT issue sorted out, we'll go to the online responses. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think that there is quite a big history in terms of how we got to where we are now. And I mean, the story of Eskom is not a secret in South Africa. And I think a lot of it also it has to do with, if you just follow that story, it has to do with how for a very long time, the story of energy was mainly focused on generation, putting on new coal and then forecasting that we need this much more energy, and then essentially just focusing everything more on the generation side. If you've followed a bit of the Eskom / energy story, is that one of the nice descriptions that I've come across about the energy story is that for a very long time the transmission grid was the Cinderella. It was neglected, not really something we actually talked about until in bid window 6 we just got the very harsh reality of the fact that there's all these megawatts that can come online, but all of a sudden we can't actually plug them in because there isn't enough transmission. And I feel like at that point it became, transmission is all of a sudden a big topic now. So I think the focus was so deep on generation and all the politics and the coal lobby and that story that we sort of forgot about the transmission part of the story as well. So I think it boils back to poor long-term planning and essentially just reacting as opposed to proactively trying to identify what are going to be the barriers for economic growth in the future. Just seeing one side of the story without actually looking at what other things it links to, you know. So we're just thinking about, we just need this much megawatt, but not actually about how are we going to take the megawatts to where it needs to go to. So I think it's a lot of poor planning and essentially just ignoring the grid because it wasn't a political structure. The grid doesn't really care if it's renewables or coal, or so there hasn't really been that much to talk about, or that it's not very politicized like you would have with generation. So I think all that attention just went to generation, and then when the grid finally stopped stuff from going forward for both sides, it suddenly became the main character of the story. So yeah, I mean, you can discuss it more after, but that's my answer for now.
Okay, thank you very much. I will get back to the auditorium again just for 3 more questions, and then we'll have the responses to Muhammad and Devin's questions once we have the online community back on. Do we have further questions or comments from the auditorium? I'd love to take 3. There's 1 at the end, 2 here, 3. So let's start from here so that we're quite efficient.
Thank you. I would like to commend all the presenters for the insightful presentations. My name is Temwani Ndiako. I'm coming from Malawi, working with Ministry of Mining. My question is on the presentation by, is it the taxonomy? Jason. Yes. No, Solid.
Oh yeah, sorry.
So I'm looking at the EU taxonomy and the South African taxonomy. If it seems that the practicability of the South African one is very difficult. So I'm looking at if the South African taxonomy would come into contact with, I don't know where they can meet to learn or how the EU taxonomy is being implemented. And if that is the case, where is the EU getting the capital to build the trainings and the guidelines and etc.? If that is the case, then we need to find a platform where the EU and the South African can meet and get and learn how the EU succeeded in doing that. So my question is to the presenter, is that have you find out if this is possible? Thank you.
Yeah, so my question is about the EU Green Deal. Seeing the way you present it, it seems it looks like an opportunity for African countries. But I wonder what you think also about the AfCFTA, because I don't remember hearing you mention that. And that's because this is about the EU deal. But between the EU deal and the AfCFTA, what, in your opinion, offers more opportunities for Africa and industrial policy? Thank you.
Thank you. We go to the last question. Round of questions at the back there.
It's an observation. It's not a question. The interest is on, is it Seutame, where in his presentation he refers to the need for skills and capacity development. But the presentation by, is it Son, on taxonomy refers to the inability to finance that. Now, for me, the interesting part is that if you don't build skills and focus on capacity development, it leaves you as a consumer of other people's products and or services, because you do not have the capacity to either, participate meaningfully in any of those activities. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So we'll get to the responses from Sören. There were 3 questions that were asked to you. I think the first 2 were from Muhammad and Devin, and then the last one is more of an observation. So if you'd like to make a comment, please proceed.
Good. I hope you can hear me now. Let me start with Muhammad's question on the on how the taxonomy can help this internal management of private actors. I don't think that this is the main purpose of the taxonomy. The main purpose is clearly aimed at redirecting capital flows, influencing investment decisions. But nevertheless, I do think that the taxonomy could help real economy actors to assess their own economic activities and see where they stand with respect to thresholds and criteria that included in the taxonomy, and see to what extent their activities are green and what needs to be done for them to get to more sustainable economic activities. So that's the way how the taxonomy could help in internal management. Yeah, allow for an assessment of the status quo of the economic activities of an economic actor. And the second question by Saul Levin, I agree that it's worrying that taxonomy is not used yet. The question was if a different approach is necessary, a different taxonomy should be used. I tend to believe that it's not the content of the taxonomy itself that's a problem, but rather the way it's currently implemented. So I think there's, as I highlighted in the presentation, a need for regulatory embedding. There need to be, I guess there need to be mandatory rules how the taxonomy should be used and that it should be used. Yeah, I don't think that a voluntary approach will work. If one tries a voluntary approach, it needs at least incentives for market actors to use taxonomy. So I think the main problem currently is with the lack of these accompanying measures that really ensure that the taxonomy is used. And I do think that processes on financial markets have to change. I also think that international investors will increasingly demand sustainability information, want to make sure that they invest in sustainable activities. So I think it's unavoidable that processes are established also on the South African financial markets to transmit this kind of sustainability information, to increase transparency on sustainability risks included in portfolios and so on. And that's something where the taxonomy potentially can play a role, but that goes beyond what the taxonomy can do. With respect to the third question on the experiences of the EU, I agree that exchanging best practices, learning from experiences in other countries is very important, as all over the world currently taxonomies are implemented, not only in the EU and South Africa, but also in other countries. And there are platforms that could be used to exchange experiences. For instance, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance initiated by the EU, or the International Banking and Financing Network by the IFC. So I think it would be a good opportunity also for South African governance actors to engage in these networks to learn about experiences elsewhere. The biggest difference between the EU approach and the South African approach is that the EU has a mandatory approach. So over the next years, all financial market participants, but also real economy firms of a certain size will have to report on the taxonomy. But it's still early days to report on experiences of this approach in the EU, as it's currently only stepwise implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sören. So we had two questions directed to Jason. Could you kindly respond to the two questions that were asked to you? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Sol and Mohammed, for the questions. I'm going to start with Sol's question. Maybe just, it's a critical point of clarification. Maybe it got lost in the metaverse there. From our point of view, we are viewing green hydrogen as commercially viable. Given the potential, all the plans gone into it and all the analysis done thus far, I think, should it become viable, which we believe it could, there are critical industrial policy sectoral specific industrial policy questions that need to be asked. And that's where we pitched the paper at. So, you know, aside from its viability, we think that it will have a potential impact on South Africa's industrial base, but of course this requires a lot of factors coming into play. And, you know, we've given some kind of high level overviews of the key sectors that potentially could benefit and be impacted from green hydrogen. But more detail is required, and a deeper dive into these specific sectors will really help us understand more of the nuances related to each sector's transition.
Yeah, I think thanks for the question. I think that's so the question on the AFCTA, right? So I mean, you know, climate change issues are still new issues, right? Not only in the African continent, so globally they're still new, right? So within that context, you start to see that, you know, the AU is, you know, as much as there's climate change issues that they talk about there, they didn't actually make link between trade and climate change. So, and we start to see some debates, you know, happening now, for example, at the WTO, around trying to find the connections there. Right. So my general sense is that we have to speak about these issues, right, where even the AU and, you know, the AFCT can actually take some of these, you know, issues into consideration. And from the presentation I made, you can see that, you know, some of these global climate change policies, they actually gonna impact, you know, the continent in the near future, as compared to, for example, the implementation of the AFCT, which I think a lot of people might say that it's gonna take some time to implement that, right? But, you know, for my side, you know, the AFCTA, the African Free Continental Area, is a huge opportunity for the African market, especially considering that, for example, if, you know, we denied market access to, let's say, Europe or in America, then we can utilize, you know, the opportunities that comes under the AFCTA. Right, so there's a lot of opportunities there that we can tap into. But I mean, I think a lot of people might need to, you know, earlier on, people were saying that we still have a long way to go with regards to the African Free Continental Area. But for me, there's a lot of opportunities that we can utilize and make sure that, you know, the program becomes faster than we initially thought, you know, using some of the pressures that we get from, you know, these global North countries. So, and you're right by saying that, you know, the European Green Deal is both an opportunity and a challenge, and I agree with you there. So,
thank you. So just before you put the mic down, there's a question to you on the online platform, and it basically is saying great presentation on EU Green Deal. Well, read 1 and 2 are unblocking waste to energy project, especially in the double counting stipulation. So the question that is being asked by Ronald is, what are the implications for our aviation industry, basically around the fuels? What are the implications on the aviation industry of the European Green Deal? Thank you.
I mean, there's so the European Green Deal include, you know, most sectors, right? So on the transport, there's aviation there included. There's also vehicles as well. So, but I mean, there are a lot of opportunities now. I think people are already investigating, for example, in sustainable, you know, fuels for the aviation, you know, our sector, which I think is an opportunity. I think, you know, it relates back to the green hydrogen opportunities that I think other participants have been saying there. So, I mean, the main point is to move away from fossil fuels, right? So creating some of the other alternatives, I think that's what, you know, I think is being talked about now. And a lot of institutions are investigating some of those alternatives. So I think that's what I would say. But I think, you know, it's already covered under the European Green Deal. So there's going to be impacted. So we might need to look at alternatives in that space as well. And of course, people are already, you know, trying to investigate that as with the other ones, looking at hydrogen and the like. So.
Thank you, Maimele. So we have 3 more questions on the online platform, and I know Jason is back. So the 3 questions typed here are directed to you. So as you proceed to continue your responses to what you had started earlier. Let me just read the questions to you for the benefit of the people in the auditorium, but I know you can see the questions online. So the first one is saying, is coming from Elsina, and it's saying, what are the envisaged challenges in implementing the green hydrogen revolution in RSA, which is South Africa? And do you think South Africa is ready, taking into cognizance implications for waste and cost management, environmental safety, etc.? Then the next question is from Nicola, and directed to you, Jason, again. It says, how do you see the needed skills development happening in South Africa for the green hydrogen economy? As it stands, the literature mentions huge skills development that will happen in TVET colleges, but is this plausible looking at the current status of South Africa's TVET ecosystem? Then the third question to you, Jason, is from Bernard, and simply saying, thanks, Jason. I was wondering if you could please describe some economic hurdles and benefits for the green hydrogen use cases for the South African industry and mobility and the export. So in brackets, they have PPA durations, which I'm sure you can see. So you have basically 5 questions to respond to. I appreciate if you could respond in good time. Thank you.
Thank you. I took some time to look at all the questions. There are a couple others I'll try and kind of address in turn. I want to come back to Sol's point. I'm not sure how much you all heard about my response to Sol's question regarding he understood the presentation to claim that the GH2 was commercially unviable. I want to correct that, and I think one of the issues critically that we take as a given in this paper is that we view green hydrogen as a commercially viable alternative to our current coal base. Now, of course, within that, it's not going to be an easy process, an easy transition as an economy, but also within these particular sectors, and it requires a lot of factors coming into play to ensure the efficacy, and I guess even the viability of green hydrogen as a transition away from and delinking away from coal, in particular these high emitting sectors. To come towards Mohammed's question regarding backward linkages to green hydrogen, I guess talking about costs, etc. We haven't done any detailed analysis of these issues in particular, although it's crucial to understand, and there needs to be a proper undertaking of this. The best available data we've seen is projecting that our costs of green hydrogen technologies and infrastructure will decrease over time, which of course links to Sol's point about the viability of green hydrogen as a sector and a technology. But I would say that we are in a good position given our strong solar and wind yields to really take this opportunity and run with it quite far down the road. Pushing on to the one question regarding whether SA is ready for green hydrogen, I would venture and say yes, but a big if, the political economy factors of the specific sectors that we focus on, and any other sector that you want to think about applying green hydrogen technologies to, those need to be understood well enough. Of course, we delve into them in a very high level analysis at this stage, with the potential to dive deeper into them and properly understand the different use cases, as we'll link to the next question, for green hydrogen, and what are the benefits and hurdles within the specific sectors and those specific sectors' use cases. A blanket policy will surely fail if we try and apply it a one-size-fits-all to every sector. We need to understand where the different opportunities lie at the different levels of the respective value chains that we are looking to transform and transition, using green hydrogen as a catalyst in that regard. To come towards, again, the benefits and hurdles of green hydrogen, the different use cases, we haven't done any kind of specific analysis of technologies or projects or case studies in these sectors, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. But this is something that can be researched, needs to be researched to almost give a bit of a business case, make a business case for green hydrogen in these different sectors. To pivot to the TVET college ecosystem question, a very kind of from left field question in a sense. Again, skills and upskilling workers is a critical component of the just transition. We acknowledge that it's an important aspect. Again, we haven't done a detailed dive into the skills for green hydrogen for any kind of sector. Again, the skills will be specific to the different sectors. There's issues relating around the different seaters that are closely linked to these sectors and the firms that report to them and pay their levies to them. But this is part of a broad capabilities development story that needs to be understood and addressed. There's no silver bullet here to ensure that green hydrogen is successful. Like I mentioned in my presentation, there's a flurry of different competing factors, but complementary factors as well that need to be work in concert to really ensure that green hydrogen is successful in different sectors. If I can quickly go to a couple of other questions I saw. The one focused on, I guess, the lack of detailed discussion of the inputs into green hydrogen. Again, critical from its commercial viability standpoint. We believe the potential is there. There are issues with those different renewable energy projects. We mentioned it in other work as well. Particularly the stop-start nature of our renewable energy patterns and trends, particularly relating to the RIPP, is something that needs to be avoided. And we need to, now that it's kind of got going again, we need to ensure that we can ramp it up and ensure that renewable energy is a critical component to our energy mix, but also to ensuring that green hydrogen can do its intended work. So this, I guess, maybe to sum up everything, we need to prioritize green hydrogen and, of course, the different factors influencing it as part of a basket of incentives that will simultaneously tackle decarbonization and try and mitigate potential export risks in the key sectors we speak about, cement, steel, and chemicals, but also across South Africa as a whole. There's a strong focus now in the discourse on jobs, investment, innovation, and of course, aligning those with environmental objectives that don't necessarily go hand in hand. There's typically always a trade-off. So there needs to be a lot of consideration of how we can combine all these objectives to maximize each one of their agendas. I think that pretty much tackles everything. There's a lot thrown at me.
Thank you, Jason. You actually responded to some which I didn't mention because they came on much later. So we have 3 more questions on the online platform. I will just go through them and then we close with the questions from the auditorium. So the first one, I would direct it at Maimele. I think it's directed to you. So it's basically about the carbon border adjustment mechanism and saying, how is CBAM fair to the developing countries and what can we do about its unfairness, because large part of climate change emission is from industrialized Europe. I think you referred to this, so we can respond to this. And let me read the next question for Alboricah. And this, I hope you get the question clearly, is basically around the core issue. So the question is from Lucindiso, and the question is the renewable low energy versus core high energy and the dumping of the low energy by ESCOM not connecting to the grid due to drop in frequency or voltage. It's got a question mark at the end, so I hope that's clear. You could probably comment on that. I think that's how it's phrased. Then the last one would be for Nicola. And I think it's really about unlocking carbon funding. So the question is, please kindly advise on how to unlock the carbon funding. So I'm assuming because you made a presentation on the carbon standards, you could comment on this. So those last 3 questions from the online community, and then we close with the last 3 questions from the auditorium. Thank you. Maimele, you can start.
Thanks for the question on CBAM. So, I mean, looking at CBAM also has a lot of issues, right? So there's some infrastructural issues in terms of, for example, countries in the global south or even in the world to have what they call monitoring, reporting, and verification systems, right? And we know that, for sure that CBAM is going to be implemented for its transition phase this year, October the 1st. So, they're going to require some of these firms that export, for example, cement, iron ore, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers and the like. So they'll be required to report on the GHG emissions that goes into the production of those goods, right? So what we can do from the African context is that, African firms might need to start looking into having that system in place. I'm sure, there's a lot of issues around having that system in place, because it's going to be firstly expensive for exporting firms. But I think, for example, government can act as a facilitating, agent there to make sure that, some of the firms might have, who don't have, the GHG, the MR, the MVR system in place, that they need to have that, or proactively, engaging with the EU to say that, we don't have this, how can you support us to, implement the mechanism? And of course, in parallel to that, it comes back to the WTO issues, right? So next year, Feb, there's going to be MC Ministerial Conference 13. So some of these issues they've already started, coming out. So what we can do, I think, through the African group is that, they need to raise some of these issues at the WTO next year, and, the following year as well, to reiterate some of these issues that will impact the continent. So I think in the meantime, those might be the two issues. Of course, as we go on, our questions about decarbonizations, increasing renewable energy, I think it comes back to what she was saying, earlier on, that, there might be some opportunities there, for example, for iron and steel, and the like. So there's got to be a need for increasing renewable, energy capacity, for example, in the production of some of those products, not only for CBAM, but in general for the other goods that are covered under the European Green Deal. And of course, there are other issues, that comes from the global north. So they're introducing these policies. So it means that the impact that we see, not, only from the European Green Deal now, is that it's going to be multiplied, because other jurisdictions will start implementing the same thing, right? So then we're not going to have, market to some of those, market as a continent. So, but
thank you, Alboricah, in less than a minute.
I'll do my best. So the point that was brought up is about low energy from renewable energy, and then high energy from coal, which is a point I do get, that with renewable energy, you get a lot less electricity generated in terms of energy intensity of what you can do with your power plant. Maybe with one power plant for renewables, you'll only get like 15 megawatts, but with coal, you can get something like 700 megawatts. So then there's definitely a bigger grid that's required for a renewable plant than there is for coal. So there's definite advantages to coal in that you can be a lot more energy intensive with the space that you have, but it doesn't negate the fact that we still have to migrate from coal because of the climate change impacts. Coal is also a lot more expensive. It needs a very long lead time. So it isn't really a solution, even though it has that high energy advantage. It's also underperforming at the moment, so you can't even refurbish because all the power plants are so old. So it's not a viable option for South Africa at the moment, even if we put global climate change concerns aside. It is not the economic case either way. And the point on the frequency is that renewable energy, unlike coal, you can't really control the input like you would with coal, because you can just dump coal, burn coal, and then you spin the turbine. But with the wind, you can't control how much wind is going in, how much sun is being able to be generated. So you have to have, it's also more technologically robust for the grid when you have renewable energy, because it means now you need to put in inverters to actually accommodate for that lack of control that you have on your inputs. So it definitely does create a more complex grid when we have renewables over coal. But I argued that the case is still renewables, just because of the bigger picture of trying to decarbonize, of trying of what is cheaper, what is faster, what is economically viable in terms of trade as well internationally. But the points I definitely noted that there are advantages to coal that unfortunately we cannot use anymore. That, yeah, because it's just not viable, I feel, in the long term.
Thank you very much. So the last question, Nicola, around carbon funding, how can we unlock that? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's a general question, but in the context of carbon trading, specifically the voluntary carbon markets. So again, just to push the point again, the DMRE framework needs to be signed off first so that local projects can go online and be funded towards the carbon tax. Because as it stands, if you want that to happen, you're looking at it, R1 million plus to be verified by your gold standard or your Vera. So yeah, so for that, basically the kind of final conclusion is, yeah, DMRE framework needs to be signed, and then these local standards can go online, and the huge amounts of carbon finance that are there can then be unlocked. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your patience. We had a few challenges, but you were with me throughout and with the panelists. I didn't see a single person dozed. So could we give ourselves a round of applause? Thank you, and thank you to the panelists.